Hello, everybody. I am Dr. Terri Daniel, and I'm so happy to be here and so grateful to the Theosophical Society for inviting me to talk about this really important and wonderful topic. And the title of my talk, which I often give to NDE, near-death experiencer groups, is Now That We Know, What Should We Do? And what does that mean, you may wonder? Well, I was having a conversation with Dr. Raymond Moody about 5 years ago. I'm sure most of you know who he is. And we were talking about how we've now got so many accounts of near-death experiences from all over the world. Thousands, tens of thousands perhaps, and we have a lot of information about what people experience. There's a lot of bona fide academic research on this, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But we were saying to each other, now that we have all this, what are we going to do with it? You know, there's only so many times you can go to meetings of IANs and tell your stories of your near-death experience. There's only so many stories that you can just tell over and over again. But what has to happen next is that some sort of action has to be taken with all this information. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about. What are we going to do with what we know now? So before we get into that, I think I should just tell you all a little bit about my background and why I feel like I have something to say about this. I was raised in a secular Jewish family that had no religious beliefs of any kind. I remember when I was 14 years old, I asked my father, where do Jews go when they die? And he said, without missing a beat, to the Cadillac dealership. That was my only religious upbringing about the afterlife. So I was free to investigate on my own. Right about that same time, a Krishna temple moved in around the corner from my house. So here I was, 14, 15 years old. I would go over to the Krishna temple and listen to the lectures and join them for their Sunday feasts. And I started to absorb a lot of Hinduism, which I loved. It was also the 60s, so psychedelics helped a lot with my inner journeying. When I was 16, I decided to read the Bible. There wasn't even a Bible in my house. I had to go and buy one at a thrift shop, and I started reading it. And just because I wanted to know what all the fuss was about with all this religion and spiritual stuff. So I did the best I could to read all the way through it. And then when I was 19, I discovered the Tibetan Book of the Dead and read that, and that made more sense to me than anything I had heard anywhere. And basically, if you don't know, the Tibetan Book of the Dead basically is an ongoing guidebook, or really a continuing prayer for guiding the soul of a dead person through the immediate afterlife, known as the 49 days of Bardo. And what happens in the Tibetan tradition is the priest will sit with the dead body and talk to the soul, or the consciousness, they don't really call it a soul, and say, okay, here you are walking through the realm of memory, and here you are walking through the realm of darkness and light, and look over there, there's white light, and look over there, there's yellow light. Go to the white light, and look over here, and now you're in the realm of the ghosts and the demons. Don't listen to those pesky demons. Those are just your projections and your fears that you've carried through this incarnation. Understand that's all those are. Don't identify with them. Don't be attached. Keep moving over this way to the light, etc. And in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, what it says eventually happens when we incarnate is we start to be attracted to things of the earth. You know, the nature, the ocean, the feelings of, connecting to other physical beings. And ultimately, we are drawn to the energy of two people having sex. And we're like, oh, I remember what that's like. That's very powerful. And those two people are the people who become your parents. And your consciousness jumps in there and gets conceived. I thought that was pretty amazing when I was 19 years old. So that's kind of how I got started on all this. And fast forward now many, many years, and I'm in my 40s, and my 10-year-old son was diagnosed with a life-threatening illness and given 5 to 10 years to live. He died when he was 16, and right after he died, I began having intense communications with him. And he basically said, okay, I'm over here on this side and you're over here on that side. This is what we came here to do together. Let's get to work. We have books to write, studying to do, things to teach. And so he's sort of become my buddy on the other side through all this work. And since then, I dedicated myself to this. I went back to school and got degrees in theology and pastoral counseling. I started the Afterlife Conference in 2009, which is now going into its 11th year. You can find that at afterlifeconference.com. And I do research on death and grief and everything around it. So that's a little bit on my background. And what I often talk about is how out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences in particular, are culturally subjective. In fact, I'm teaching a class on that this fall. And it's fascinating because most of what we know about NDEs, near-death experiences, if I asked you all to raise your hand right now and tell me 2 or 3 qualities of an NDE, you would probably say what most people experience is they go through some sort of tunnel. They are being pulled toward a bright light. They see perhaps an angel or a spirit or a being of light or a family member or a friend or a religious figure waiting for them. They feel immense love and peace. This isn't 100% always true, but this is the sort of classic definition of what happens. And they may have a conversation where the being tells them they have a choice to stay or go back, and they decide to come back. That's kind of the classic Western near-death experience. But now that we have an internet and we have access to so much information about other cultures and other religious views, we're finding that this isn't true necessarily outside of our Western Judeo-Christian culture. There are similarities between particular cultures, but they're different from Western European experiences. Raymond Moody, in his breakthrough work in 1975, described some of those characteristics that I just mentioned as being pretty typical. But we're now finding that when compared with that typical prototype NDE, what's coming in from other cultures is very different. So I'm going to show you a little chart right now. I'm going to share my screen. And we're going to look at this chart. This is from a study that was in a Thanatology Death Studies journal. And these are, non-Western countries that they studied. And what they found is that religious figures appeared in these experiences much more commonly in these countries than they do in European Western countries. But even in all of these countries, Africa, China, Germany, I don't know why Hawaii is in there, India, Israel, Netherlands, Thailand, religious figures weren't that common. What they were experiencing much more is relatives, deceased persons, spirits, sense of timelessness, light, landscapes, otherworldly realms. These things were very consistent, where religious figures really were not. So that's kind of important, because religion has a lot to do with what we experience. So in my work that I do, I was a hospital chaplain for 3 years and worked with a lot of very ill people and dying people. And I found very much that they would have these experiences or these visions or these expectations based on their religious beliefs. So what we have found in a lot of the research is if you are a Christian and believe that you're going to go to a heaven with the streets of gold and the harps and the angels and Jesus, you're pretty likely going to see that during your near-death experience. A Hindu is not going to see that. Melvin Morse, in his work in the 1970s, studied the near-death experiences of children. And they were very young children, 3 to 7 years old. And what he found with them is that they, in their NDEs, experienced exactly what they'd been taught by their families. So if a kid was raised in a Christian house, he would see Jesus. You probably heard the famous story. I think it's a book and a movie, The Boy Who Came Back from Heaven or something, I think it was called. And he talks about how he went to heaven and he sat on Jesus's lap. And Jesus told him that he had to go back. The kids who were raised without any religion of any kind saw things like, the one I remember the most from Melvin's book is the child said, "I flew up into the sun and the sun hugged me." So the sun was light. So that kid didn't have any religious figures. Some of the kids who also didn't have religious indoctrination saw their grandparents. Some of them saw Disney characters. So if you haven't read Melvin Morse's book, Closer to the Light, I mean, it's 40-something years old now, but it's extremely important for this work. Melvin Morse and Raymond Moody, as you probably know, were the breakthrough people on this. On the Christian side, there are lots of accounts of going to heaven and seeing Jesus. There's a very famous one by a man named Don Piper. His book was called 15 Minutes in Heaven. He was a Christian pastor. He had a lot of this kind of stuff. So a book I would recommend to you, there's 2 of them that discuss this in depth. One is by Mark Mirabello, and it's called A Traveler's Guide to the Afterlife. And the other one is by Gregory Shushan, Shushan, called Near-Death Experiences in Indigenous Religions. And what they talk about is how different all these intercultural things are. So for example, Mirabello gives some examples of if you, in the Zulu tribe, they believe that anybody can reincarnate as an animal, but only a chief can come back as a lion. Now, how do they know this? Where did they get this idea from? Probably because some of them have had their own near-death experiences, and when they were out there in the other realms, they saw their relatives, they saw beings that they recognized, perhaps in the form of animals, but the only lion was always a chief. Then this person might be resuscitated or come back from death and say to his tribe, "I saw my aunt and my mother and my horse, but the lion was the chief." And that's where people get these things. Where do we get these ideas of what we see when we're visiting the afterlife briefly? We get them from reports of people who have been there. So every prototype that you've heard about heaven, about the afterlife, comes from somebody who's been there and told us about it. That old cliche that no one's ever died and come back to tell us about it is a bunch of hooey, because we know that that's not true. Lots of people have. So back to the multicultural things. The Eskimos leave the skull of a bear they have killed face down at the place where it died, which allows it to be reborn. And if you don't place it exactly in that way, the poor little bear will not be able to be reborn again. I don't know why it would want to, but okay. In many traditions, it's believed that if you have a son that guarantees the well-being of all your deceased ancestors. The tribes of North Nigeria believe that a person who dies of old age has a more vigorous soul, and when he goes to the next world, he will have power, versus a person who dies young, whose soul hasn't shown enough vigor to stay in a body longer. So there's all these ideas. Here's one from Tonga. The souls of the nobles survive death and go to a paradise from which the gods came, and which the souls of the deceased chiefs go to. Commoners, however, have no souls. With death, they just perish forever. So there's all these different beliefs that when we're looking at, the prototype NDE of the tunnel and the light and the angels and the love, we're forgetting to include all of this. So let's go back for a minute to how these things are reported. You may have heard that there is a tradition, the phrase "saved by the bell." Have you heard where this supposedly comes from? In Europe, I believe, in ancient times, relatively ancient times, they didn't really know when a person was dead, right? They didn't have stethoscopes and brainwave detectors. So when a person appeared to be dead by lack of breathing and lack of heartbeat, they would bury them. But they would tie a little string around the finger of the corpse, and the string would run out of the coffin and up through the ground, tied to a little bell on a stake stuck next to the grave. Because sometimes the people would wake up. And when they'd wake up and move their finger, the bell would ring, and all the people from the village would come and unbury them. Now, I don't know if this is absolutely true. It could just be like an urban myth, but supposedly that's where the expression "saved by the bell" comes from. So let's say this person is taken back out of the grave. Where was he when he was in there? Well, his consciousness was out of his body to the point where he appeared dead, and he traveled somewhere. And so he may have come back and told the story of where he was. This is where we get all these stories from the Tongan people and the Eskimo people and whatever we have. It all comes from people who've been there. So what are the next steps? My whole point in this talk is, what are we going to do with this knowledge? Here we all are. We're very interested in this subject. Many of us are academics who, have the resources to do research, to go out and speak publicly. Some of us are spiritual teachers or just spiritual seekers who have knowledge to share and can use this knowledge to help ourselves and help others. I really would like to focus on taking this stuff out of the metaphysical, new age, woo-woo world and putting it into the mainstream. That's where it belongs. Because for so many of us are preaching to the choir. So if you look at some of the people who are out there as authors and speakers, probably many of them you've had as speakers at your meetings, who had a near-death experience or profound spiritually transformative experience, which is now called STE, spiritually transformative experience, and they write a book about it. Or they have an NDE and they go right from the operating table to the podium and become a famous motivational speaker or author or speaker. I'm not going to mention names, but there's a lot of them out there. And they know a lot about their own experience, but a lot of them haven't stepped back and looked at multicultural experiences and other types of experiences, nor have they done anything like gone and meditated in a monastery for a year or gone back to school and studied comparative religion and theology and psychology and even physiology and all these other things that we need to know if we're really going to be qualified to teach this. And I say this, with a little bit of arrogance because that's what I did. I was so fascinated by the theological influences in these spiritual experiences that I went back to school and got a degree in religious studies because I wanted to know what other religions think and whether religion can help or harm us in these experiences. And I'm going to go and divert to another little story here. In the years that I was a chaplain at a hospital, I would see a lot of suffering, and people who were dying, who were looking at end of life, would have guilt and regret and fear about going to hell. Or people who were grieving, who believed in hell and punishment, would never really regain balance and restoration in their grief process because they were so worried that their loved one was in hell because it was a suicide, or because he died getting shot while robbing a store, or maybe he was a really bad guy, like the guy who goes into a school and shoots the kids, and then he gets killed, and that guy has a mother who's afraid that he's in hell. And maybe some people do think he's in hell. I don't know. One of the best things I've learned how to say in my last 10 years of theology school is, I don't know. I only know what I have studied and seen and heard from so many of these teachers and these experiencers. And I cannot say what is going to happen in your afterlife or mine, but I can only say what I've heard has happened in other people's afterlives. Now, I've had wonderful glimpses of these other realms in the afterlife because I channeled my son for so long and I got a lot of information from him. But I don't know how much of that is coming through some sort of filter through my belief systems. So we always have to be really discerning about just, believing that everybody goes through a tunnel of light and is embraced by the love of spirit. Now, I will also talk about, there have been reports of traumatic and negative near-death experiences, and we do have some data on that. So the number one researcher in this field right now is Dr. Sam Parnia. He's at Stony Brook, I believe, but he did his research in England. And he did a study called the AWARE study, and AWARE is an acronym for, I can't remember, but it's the largest study ever done on NDEs. I believe it was in 2000, interviewed 2,000 patients from 15 hospitals in England, the USA, and Australia. And it revealed a broad range of mental experiences in relation to death. It's called the AWARE study. One of the things, in fact, 46% of people experienced fearful or persecutory experiences. And these fearful experiences are not considered in the classical definitions of NDEs that we heard from Moody and Morse back in the day. So they're not compatible with the common models of NDE. So why would someone experience that? Well, a religious person would tell you it's because they were a bad person and they went to hell in their NDE. But what researchers tend to think is that it has to do with the belief systems that they carry with them. So if this person was suicide, let's say, and believes that he's going to hell and believes that about himself even before the suicide, he would have that experience of being in something that he believes is the image of hell that he's had all his life. So not only are these experiences culturally subjective, a Hindu isn't likely to see Jesus, a Christian isn't likely to see the Hindu pantheon of gods, they're also subjective according to what we bring with us. So if we have a life of rage and anger and hate and evil racism and just all that awful stuff, if we're that kind of person in life, we're going to encounter ourselves in these initial moments on the other side. Remember, we're only just in the threshold with an NDE. It's like walking into a big house, but you're only just in the doorway. And you've stepped over the doorway, and you're there for a few minutes, and then whoosh, you're back out again. That's as far as you got into the house. You didn't go all the way through the house. That's where you go when you're actually really dead. In an NDE, you're just inside the threshold. And so you're only seeing the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. And so what happens at that part of it is you're still so connected to your earthly life that you're bringing it in with you. And you have to, over time, you shed all those attachments and connections, but just inside that doorway, you haven't done that shedding yet. You haven't purged that yet, which I think is where the concept of purgatory comes from. It's very common to have a life review. I've heard it described where people, visualize and and reenact bad, painful moments in their life, hurtful things they've done to other people so that they could see and feel that the pain that they've caused. You have this whole life review thing that goes on in the classic NDE. And these hellish experiences are probably some form of that. And it's interesting because it connects with the Tibetan Buddhist story in the Book of the Dead, where you encounter hellish realms, hungry ghosts, they call them, demons. Those demons are all from inside of you. They're not ever external. And so part of the process of purging and clearing yourself, if you're going to remain dead and go through the stages, the bardo, into your next incarnation or wherever you go next, is you do have to do that purging process. And that's the healing. That's the clearing and the cleaning that you get before the next thing, whatever the next thing is, which I believe is, another incarnation, but not necessarily all the time for everybody. Okay, so let's go back to what I was going for before talking about the next step. So what are we going to do about all this stuff? Because it's such good stuff, isn't it? So as I was saying, I decided to go back to school and get theology degrees and become trained as a hospice chaplain and a pastoral counselor so that I could work in clinical settings with dying and grieving people who are coping with these visions and with the afterlife questions. And so that's what I personally chose to do. And I did that so that I would be accepted in the mainstream. Prior to getting all these credentials, I didn't have any. I never went to college at all until I was 56. I would try to, give a talk at a hospice or various types of groups. And I really couldn't get my foot in the door of any mainstream places because I didn't have the credentials. So that's why I went and got them. That's how important it was to me. So if you don't want to preach to the choir, the option is to get some training and credentials that will get you out into the mainstream world. That's one of the first things that I like to say in terms of what can we do? How can we become more proactive? Another thing you can do if you want to become active and get more experience with this stuff, and really, besides just reading all the books that are out there, sit with the dying. And perhaps you sat with your mother or your wife when they were dying and you had that experience, but it's very different when it's somebody you love and you're close to than if it's a stranger or a client. So I urge people who are interested in this topic to become a hospice volunteer. Pretty much anybody can be a hospice volunteer. There are many levels of volunteering you can do. You do have to go through some training, but you will ultimately be able to accompany people through their process of facing death and dying. And in that capacity, you will have wonderful conversations with them, and they will tell you about what they're experiencing. And I remember one time I was volunteering at an inpatient hospice, and there was a lady that I had seen for a couple of weeks. So I was familiar with her. We didn't talk much because she wasn't very verbal, but on the last day I saw her, she was lying in bed, unresponsive, barely conscious, mostly out of her body. And she hadn't really talked in several days, which is typical. And all of a sudden, she turned her head and looked at me and she said, "It's just like swimming," which I thought was the most awesome thing in the world. She was describing to me what it was like to be going in and out between the worlds. I had another hospice lady. I gave her this guided meditation that I often do, where you close your eyes and you visualize that you're looking at a starry sky, but instead of white stars, they're all the colors in the spectrum. And you begin to do some deep breathing, and you breathe in the starlight, let it fill your body, and then breathe it out. And with each breath in of breathing light, you breathe in love and peace, and with each breath out, you blow out fear and anxiety. So I was giving this lady this meditation. She was very responsive at the time. The next time I saw her, she was declined, not as responsive, but she recognized me, and she told me that she had a dream. And in her dream, an angel came to her bed and gave her some pills, put some pills on her tongue. But instead of pills, they were little stars. So this dream she was telling me was a sort of conflation of something she dreamed and me giving her that meditation. So that meditation with the stars had actually gone into her consciousness and helped her. So being around dying people is an amazing education and experience. And if you want to become a hospice volunteer, just call any hospice in your neighborhood, any of them. They love volunteers. You do, I think, a minimum of 8 hours, an 8-hour day, or maybe it's a weekend of training. And there are very specific requirements of what you can and cannot do as a volunteer. The number one thing you cannot do is preach or teach anything. You are there just to be a companion and to listen. And you really, aren't supposed to have spiritual conversations with the patients. They don't like it when you do that. That's what the chaplains are there for. But sometimes a patient might ask you, what do you think happens when we die? And in that case, you can tell them what you think, but you're never supposed to tell them what to expect. If you want to get into that level of spiritual conversation with dying people, you have to become a chaplain, which is exactly why I did it, because I wanted to have those conversations and I wasn't comfortable with the limitations of being a volunteer. The next thing I suggest to people to do to become more proactive and, getting this material into the mainstream is to study with good teachers. And when I say good teachers, again, I'm talking about the mainstream. So we've got plenty of people out there teaching at conferences and things, Anita Moorjani and Eben Alexander and all these people who are best-selling authors teaching their story. But I would suggest that you also listen to the credentialed experts, the academic researchers like Dr. Parnia, who are actually doing this work. And here's where you can find them. There's an organization called the Hospice Foundation of America, and also the Association of Death Education and Counseling. And they have online seminars all the time about this. And you can find some really good education there. If you are a social worker or somebody who needs CE credits, this is a good way to get them. And the Association for Death Education and Counseling, otherwise known as ADEC, also has a process where you can become certified in thanatology. Thanatology is the study of death, from the Greek word thanos, which means death. And you can become certified by taking a test that they give you. They give you a bunch of really excellent study materials. And the process of preparing for that test will educate you like crazy. You will learn so much. And then you'll have CT after your name, and you'll have that credential. And then people will take you seriously when you want to go give a talk to a church or a hospice or a community group. And this is what we should all be out there doing. I also, in addition to studying with good teachers, read good researched material beyond what we read in the pop spirituality world. There are academic books all about death and consciousness, written by people like Therese Rando or Ronnie Janoff-Bullman. Stuart Hameroff is another one. He's an anesthesiologist who, when he puts people under on anesthesia, he wonders, where did they go? So he's done a lot of deep study on that. There's good stuff out there. Get a credential in psychology or theology or social work or something that looks good on your resume so that you can really get out there and do this work, if that's what you want to do. And if that's not what you want to do, that's fine. Support the groups who do this. Support groups like ADEC and HFA and the Theosophical Society and, of course, the Afterlife Conference, because this is what we do. So at the Afterlife Conference, when I first started it into 2010, it was, I was very interested in psychics and mediums and near-death experience and all of that. And for the first few years, we leaned very heavy in that direction, and people really loved it. Around the fourth year, I decided that I wanted to attract more mainstream audiences. I wanted hospice nurses, doctors, theologians, academic people to come to my conference. And I realized that if I had too much mediumship and psychic stuff, it was going to scare them away. So I started balancing it different. And if you go to the website, afterlifeconference.com, you'll see how the balance is. So I might now have a doctor from the Hospice Foundation of America as a keynote, and on the second night keynote, just for example, this year we had Robert Moss, who studies dream journeying and how to communicate with the dead in the dream world. So I'll have this like hospice doctor person over here and mystic shaman over here, and all the way down the roster. That's what I'm trying to do. I had Bishop John Shelby Spong one year, who's a very, very famous radical Episcopal bishop who has really interesting things to say about how hell doesn't really exist and is an invention of the church. So I'll have Episcopal bishop over here and, you know, shaman from South America with drumming and chanting over here. So that's the kind of well-rounded learning I would like to see all of us do. It's really easy to just get, you know, hooked in to the psychic and mediumship stuff because it's fascinating. It's fascinating when someone can bring you a very clear evidential message from someone on the other side. I mean, who wouldn't want to just be steeped in that all day long? But I always ask people, you know, to try to balance that with a little bit of science, I guess you could say. So, so how can we transform how this is done out in the world? What do we want to transform with this knowledge and these skills that we have? We want to transform mental and physical health care. And speaking of mental health care, I'm going to show you another slide now. Let me find it. This is a very interesting part of this whole NDE thing. So one of the things I learned in my research is that there are a lot of features of near-death experiences that match up with diagnostic criteria for mental disorders. So many of you probably know there's a book called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM. And in it, it lists all these criteria for diagnosing. So it's basically used by big pharma so that if you are a psychiatrist, you can look at your patient's symptoms, and if they have like 4 out of 5 of these symptoms, you can give them an official diagnosis that will make it possible for you to prescribe medications for them. So here's something I found. The term nearing death awareness refers to an intuitive awareness that another world awaits, prompted by visions, dreams, and other extraordinary experience. In the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, they would call this depersonalization disorder, a sense of split self with one part observing and the other participating. So this is what you're feeling right here, a sense of separation from the body. And if you reported this at the hospital where you're having your NDE, they would send you for a psych evaluation. I've seen it happen. I believe Parney has said that something like only 2% of people who have near-death experiences actually report them. So what happens to most people is you wake up from the operating table and you've had this experience, but you don't tell anybody because you're afraid they're going to think you're crazy. And they are going to think you're crazy because of this. So here's the next one. So in a near-death experience right here, you might report having enhanced cognitive abilities and intensification of feelings. This, according to psychiatry, is delusions of grandiosity because the experience speaks of an important discovery or a great insight. So you don't want to tell that to the doctors. In an NDE, you have a cosmic encounter with light, God, or other manifestations of great ontological significance, and perhaps a recall of past life or future events. But in the DSM, this would be called bizarre delusions, defined as clearly implausible and not understandable to same culture peers, and do not derive from ordinary life experiences. Now, what's important about this is this term right here, same culture peers. So if you have a near-death experience in Tibet, and you come back on the operating table and you talk about how, you left your body and you could see your village down there as you were floating away, and you could feel cosmic consciousness embracing you. In Tibet, that would be a perfectly acceptable thing to happen, because you're telling it to your same culture peers. In Tibet, everybody believes in that. In America, if you said that to your doctors at the hospital, most likely they're going to find that very strange, because they don't come from that way of thinking. Perhaps if you said you went to heaven with streets of gold, they might find it a little more acceptable, but science doesn't find any kind of this out-of-body stuff acceptable, at least not as much as it should. Okay, another one. In an NDE, you encounter a non-ordinary realm inhabited by post-mortem others, in other words, dead people, including relatives, friends, animals, and beings of light. The DSM would call that a visual hallucination. And then finally, telepathic communication with other beings. That would be an auditory hallucination. Functioning is not markedly impaired and behavior is not bizarre or odd. Hallucinations are not prominent and are related to the delusional theme, blah, blah, blah. The point of that being that this is why people don't report their NDEs. And this is why science doesn't have enough information to really nail down some good research on this, because this is what happens if you report it. When I was a chaplain, this kid came into the emergency room. He was in his early 20s. His friends had brought him in because he had very suddenly started having visions. He wasn't on any drugs. They did a tox test on him, toxicity test. There were no drugs in his system. He just had started talking to God. And his friends thought he was flipping out and brought him to the emergency room. And so I was called in to sit with him. And he was telling me this beautiful story of how God had been talking to him and telling him this and that. And I completely believed him and supported him and understood him. And then when they wanted to take him in for the physical exam, he asked if I could go with him. I was the only person who really supported him in this. And they sent him up for a psych evaluation, and he had to be held for 3 days. So because of that, we don't get enough good research. So, okay, back to so that's what I meant by transforming mental and physical health care, is we need to work to make these ideas more acceptable in the science world. The other area that needs transformation is end-of-life care and death awareness. So hospices now are open to things like massage and Reiki and meditation and wonderful stuff. They're becoming very, very open to this kind of work. What I would like to see is somebody trained, for instance, like a death doula, in the ICU, in the emergency room, on staff at hospitals, to be with people as they are dying, to guide them through these experiences, to support them when they're seeing their visions. And we don't have that. In emergency rooms, people die horrible deaths because all that's happening in the emergency room is this team is frantically trying to keep you alive, pounding on your chest, injecting you with everything, screaming and yelling, bright lights, hysterical, panicked energy. Not a good way to die. And generally what happens, one of my friends who's an ER doctor said, nobody actually really dies in the emergency room. They just put you back together good enough to send you up to a medical floor, and that's when you die. Of course, some people, of course, do die in the emergency room, but it's a terrible death. And they should have somebody like a doula or somebody like me on staff, on salary, present in those rooms at all times when somebody is dying, to make it a peaceful experience. We'll talk more about that on Saturday. Here's something that you probably never thought of. There is little to none death awareness training in medical schools. I have a podcast called Ask Dr. Death with my friend, Dr. Karen Wyatt, a hospice physician, and she is retired. She's in her 60s. And we have guests on our show, sometimes very young doctors, residents just starting out in their 30s. And we compare their educations, like how many hours of training did you get on how to be with death? And the answer is 0, whether the person went to medical school 40 years ago or 4 years ago. So this is another thing that we want to work on transforming, is how do we push to get this kind of training in medical school? Because most doctors, all they learn about death is how to run away from it, how to avoid it. And they have no spiritual care training either. So they aren't made aware of this research that we've been talking about near-death experiences. They don't even know. Some doctors don't even know what hospice is. Many, many doctors don't know what hospice is. I encounter this all the time. I gave a lecture at a nursing school a couple of years ago. They were about to graduate, so I guess it's a 4-year program, I don't know, but they'd been in it for a while. They were finished with their coursework. And I did a 2-hour talk on death and dying, and they all told me that that was the first content they had on death and dying in their entire curriculum the whole time they were in nursing school. So doctors and nurses don't have this. So that's the other thing we want to try to, and again, the spiritual care piece. They don't have any training in comparative religion, spiritual care, any of the stuff that you need to know if you're going to be helping people who are having these experiences. Okay, next step for transforming, our culture's inability to deal with this stuff is break down unhelpful religious structures. This is already beginning to happen. The latest Pew Research numbers are showing that belief in traditional religious systems is really, really diminishing now. The millennials are the least religious population we've ever had. Church attendance is down. I attribute a lot of this to the fact that we have the internet and we have access to so many other ways of looking at things and so many teachings and the multicultural and interreligious perspectives on things. And this is really helping us adjust our view of death. When we break down these religious structures that tell us about hell and punishment, we will begin to lose our fear of death and have a different relationship with death. And that's a cultural thing too, because of the medical establishment and the whole cultural thing about death is bad and should be avoided at all costs. It's a different relationship with death. And then finally, back to mediums, I would like to see the really, really good proven evidential mediums out there provide information for science and scholarship, not just messages from loved ones. And we have mediums at the Afterlife Conference, and we talk about this all the time. People go to mediums because they are grieving and they're missing someone, and they want a message from their dead person. They want a message from their dead child or their husband, and the medium, a good evidential medium, will bring an evidential message, and I will talk about what evidential means in a minute. What people don't go to mediums for is, bring me a message from somebody who's been dead for 50 years and ask them, what are they doing right now? What's it like? I mean, you maybe want a message from your grandmother, and the message will be like, oh, I love you, honey. I left $10,000 in a shoebox under the bed, those kind of messages. What people don't ask mediums is, what are people doing right now in the afterlife? Like, how long are they there before they come back? Do they all have to come back? What goes on there? And that's the kind of stuff I would like to see mediums talking about, but that's not what people pay them for. People pay them to make them feel better with their grief. So I'd like to see a way where the mediums can talk to the scientists about what's happening in the afterlife. Oh, evidential mediums. Let me talk about that for a minute. Yeah, I said I was going to go back to evidential medium. So I'm sure that most of you listening to this already know this, but I feel like I need to say it anyway. What you want from a medium is an evidential message. And that means it's a message that only you and the dead person could possibly know. Sometimes it's even a message that you yourself don't know. So, for example, I've seen mediums say, "Oh, your mother says she loves you very much and you are a really good daughter." That is not an evidential message. Anybody could say that. I once saw a medium addressing a room full of people who were all older people. Every person in that room had gray hair. The medium looked at the room and said, "Does anybody here have a mother on the other side?" Well, pretty much 99% of the people in that room had a mother on the other side. And of course, everybody raised their hand. That is not evidential. Now, if you said that to a room full of 20-year-olds, that would be different. An evidential message says something like, "Okay, all right, John, there's a black horse standing behind you. Do you have a horse that died? I'm getting the feeling of like heat, like the horse was overheated or something." And John gets up, sobbing his eyes out, and says, "My horse died in a barn fire 6 months ago." That's an evidential message. The difference is very clear, isn't it? So that's the kind of stuff that we want to be hearing from mediums. And, and mediums are very helpful with grief. It's really, really helpful to get a message from your person on the other side if it's an evidential message. And with all these messages that are not evidential, we get so many people walking around saying mediums are phony. I went to a medium, I had a terrible experience. And that's a shame because we really don't want to have that kind of image.